2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, nations are looking for ways to coexist with the COVID-19 pathogen without shutting down their economies again with lockdowns. The United States reopened its borders in November. Britain has eased testing and quarantine requirements for vaccinated arrivals. Even countries that once had strict COVID-19 control measures such as Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore have all dropped their goal of 0 cases. Instead, most countries are trying to prevent their healthcare systems from becoming stretched to the breaking point while allowing their citizens to live semi-normal lifestyles. But there's an outlier: China. China is the last country still holding onto a strict zero-tolerance policy. Over the past 2 years, Chinese authorities say they have contained more than 30 COVID-19 outbreaks, including ones caused by the more contagious Delta variant of the coronavirus. Strict healthcare measures help keep the infection at bay, including mass testing, snap lockdowns, and extensive quarantines. Chinese authorities are experimenting with more narrowly targeted lockdowns. One example is in Shanghai, which announced on Thursday that it had identified 5 COVID cases at a milk tea shop that had been visited by a Chinese student who had recently returned from the United States. Rather than lock down the entire city or neighborhood, the government put emergency restrictions on the shop itself. A recent outbreak in China's Xinjiang province, a major industrial and export hub on the country's east coast, left more than 500,000 people in quarantine. Hundreds of factories shut down and most flights out of provincial capital Hangzhou canceled. In November, Shanghai closed Disneyland, banning anyone inside from leaving, while officials performed more than 100,000 COVID-19 tests after a single positive case. And China has locked down Yuzhou and Xi'an. Yuzhou's 1.1 million people were ordered this week to remain indoors, and Xi'an, with 13 million people, has been under the same restrictions for about 2 weeks. With the emergence of more contagious varieties such as the Delta and the new Omicron strain of the coronavirus, Beijing seems to be doubling down its effort to contain any sporadic outbreaks. U.S. President Joe Biden has unveiled new measures to combat COVID-19, saying the emergence of the Omicron variant increases the urgency for booster vaccines. Biden's plan includes tighter restrictions for international travelers and expanding access to at-home testing. U.S. President Joe Biden said the United States' COVID-19 response should not be politically divisive, and that he hoped for bipartisan backing for his plan to tackle the pandemic over winter. Biden's winter plan includes ramping up booster shots for all adults, vaccinating children, expanding at-home free testing, and stronger travel protocols. The travel measures will include requiring anyone arriving in the United States to take a test within 1 day of their flights. Now, American manufacturers are worried that China's zero-tolerance coronavirus policy could throw a wrench in the global conveyor belt for goods this year. The Biden administration is monitoring real-time data obtained from businesses operating in China to determine whether outbreaks of the Omicron variant of coronavirus pose a risk to U.S. supply chains, an administration official said. It's too early to tell whether there will be any impact on the American economy from the variant's spread in China or from aggressive efforts by officials there to stamp it out, the official said. Companies are bracing for another round of potentially debilitating supply chain disruptions as China, home to about a third of global manufacturing, imposes sweeping lockdowns in an attempt to keep the Omicron variant at bay. The measures have already confined tens of millions of people to their homes in several Chinese cities and contributed to a suspension of connecting flights through Hong Kong for much of the world for the next month. At least 20 million people, or about 1.5% of China's population, are in lockdown, mostly in the city of Xi'an in western China and Henan province in north-central China. The country's zero-tolerance policy has manufacturers already on edge from spending the past 2 years dealing with crippling supply chain woes, worried about another round of shutdowns at Chinese factories and ports. Additional disruptions to the global supply chain would come at a particularly fraught moment for companies, which are struggling with rising prices for raw materials and shipping along with extended delivery times and worker shortages. China used lockdowns, contact tracing, and quarantines to halt the spread of the coronavirus nearly 2 years ago, after its initial emergence in Wuhan. These tactics have been highly effective, but the extreme transmissibility of the Omicron variant poses the biggest test yet of China's system. So far, the effects for the lockdowns in Chinese factory production and deliveries have been limited. 4 of China's largest port cities, Shanghai, Dalian, Tianjin, and Shenzhen, have imposed narrowly targeted lockdowns to try to control small outbreaks of the Omicron variant. As of this weekend, these cities had not locked down their docks. Still, Volkswagen and Toyota announced last week that they would temporarily suspend operations in Tianjin because of lockdowns. If extensive lockdowns become more widespread in China, their effects on supply chains could be felt across the United States. Major new disruptions could depress consumer confidence and exacerbate inflation, which is already at 40-year high, posing challenges for the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve. The potential for setbacks comes just as many companies had hoped they were about to see some easing of the bottlenecks that have clogged global supply chains since the pandemic began. The combination of intermittent shutdowns at factories, ports, and warehouses around the world, and American consumers' surging demand for foreign goods has thrown the global delivery system out of whack. Transportation costs have skyrocketed, and ports and warehouses have experienced pileups of products waiting to be shipped or driven elsewhere, while other parts of the supply chain are stymied by shortages. For American companies, the prospect of further supply chain troubles means there may be another scramble to secure Chinese-made products ahead of potential closures. Lisa Williams, the chief executive of the world of EPI, a company that makes multicultural dolls, said the supply chain issues were putting pressure on companies like hers to get products on the shelves faster than ever, with retailers asking for goods for the fall to be shipped as early as May. But the spread of the Omicron variant is foiling hopes for a fast recovery, highlighting not only how much America depends on Chinese goods, but also how fragile the supply chain remains within the United States. The Biden administration has undertaken a series of moves to try to alleviate bottlenecks both in the United States and abroad, including devoting $17 billion to improving American ports as part of the new infrastructure law. Major U.S. ports are handling more cargo than ever before and working through their backlog of containers, in part because ports have threatened additional fees for containers that sit too long in their yards. Yet, those greater efficiencies have been undercut by continuing problems at other stages of the supply chain, including a shortage of truckers and warehouse workers to move the goods to their final destination. A push to make the Port of Los Angeles operate 24/7, which was the centerpiece of the Biden administration's efforts to address supply chain issues this fall, has still seen few trucks showing up for overnight pickups, according to port officials, and cargo ships are still waiting for weeks outside West Coast ports for their turn for berth to dock in. But if the coronavirus does manage to enter a big port again, the effects could quickly be felt in the United States. Air freight could also become more expensive and harder to obtain in the coming weeks, as China has canceled dozens of flights to clamp down on another potential vector of infection. That could especially affect consumer electronics companies, which tend to ship high-value goods by air. After the considerable disruptions during lockdowns last year, Chinese docks have proved increasingly able to continue operating through municipal lockdowns. To forestall infections, they have barred ship crews from coming ashore and have required some dock workers to live for many weeks at a time in nearby dormitories instead of going home to their families at night. China planned similar arrangements to keep athletes and other foreigners completely separate from its population during the Winter Olympics next month. Beijing traffic authorities have even told residents to stay away from any vehicle collisions involving Olympic participants to avoid infection.